Anyway, I'll start. My name's Jonathan Baillie. I'm the CEO of OTEC, or On the Edge, and basically it's a media and technology company for nature. And I first just want to thank the Green Games Summit, and I'll be talking to you about the status and trends of the world's species and ecosystems. But first, I'll start with just a quick bit about my background. I started at IUCN, the World Conservation Union, focusing on red lists of threatened species, so identifying which species are threatened on the planet. I then developed a number of the leading biodiversity indicators, which tell us how threatened the world's species and ecosystems are on a global scale. And then after that, I ran conservation programs for the Zoological Society of London. Most recently, I was chief scientist at Nat Geo and oversaw the international programs and the as well as all sort of the technology programs and the grants programs. And of course, now I'm the CEO of On the Edge. So I do have a presentation. I'm not sure, I can't see it.
We're just getting that loaded up for you, Jonathan. It should be up soon.
Okay, well, I'll just start anyway, just because you're time limited. But I mean, really to say that so far we've heard a lot about a lot of the climate issues, and while climate's a really important thing to think about, probably one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century, an equally evil twin is the extinction crisis. And actually, the two are really closely related because, as was mentioned before, a intact ecosystem actually absorbs carbon. And if you look at the oceans and you look at land, about 50% of the human-caused CO2 emissions are being absorbed by the world's ecosystems. And in fact, when we destroy the world's ecosystems, things get worse in terms of carbon emissions. So, for example, burning and the loss of forests lead to about 10% of the human-caused emissions that we're seeing today. But the really good news is that if you actually restore the world's species and ecosystems, then it helps us also address climate change. And actually, if we want to meet the targets that have been set for 2050, we have to restore an area roughly the size of the United States to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Any sign of my presentation?
I'm told that we're working on it, Jonathan. I'm afraid I don't have any more news for you, but I'm told that we're getting them loaded. I'm so sorry about that.
No problem. But anyway,
There we go, Jonathan. They should be live now.
Okay, so that's my first slide.
Thank you for your patience.
So this image here is called Blue Marble, and it was taken in 1972 and quickly became sort of the leading image of the environmental movement. And for me, it really shows how isolated we are, that there's this thin envelope of life. And it really begs the question, how many species, how many earthlings are on this planet? And when I started in biology, the estimates were about 30 million up to 100 million. And then more recently, they came down. There was, Bob May came out with about 8.7 million, ranged up to about 10 million. But a recent study looking at microorganisms found that there might be 1 trillion species on the planet. Now, if this is true, then, we've only described 2 million species, we don't know 99.99% of the species on the planet, which is amazing. Now, when you look at this planet, when it was taken in 1972, we were using the Earth's resources at a rate that it could actually be sustained, that it could rejuvenate. But now we're using about the equivalent of 1.5 planets. So what this means is that we're digging into the resources of future generations. And as you can see from this figure, as we go up to 2050, it's estimated we'll have 9 or 10 billion people on the planet, and we'll be using the equivalent of about 3 planets worth, which is completely unsustainable. Now, this plays itself out when we look at the world's ecosystems, and this is a map of what it would have looked like about 1,000 years ago and shows you the major biomes. Now, we fast forward to 2020, and you can see that about half the world's ecosystems have been converted into human-dominated landscapes. And of the 50% that is left, about 25% of that is relatively intact, but only 3% is actually intact. Now, if we assume business as usual with population growth and habitat loss, we can assume that we will lose many of the world's critical ecosystems by 2050. And then if you add the projections around climate change to that, it's going to be very difficult for these species to adapt to this rapidly changing world. So it's not really a surprise that if you go back to 1970 and you come to the near present, that we've had a 70% decline in the world's vertebrates. That's mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. That's an amazing figure you just have to reflect on, 70%. We can also look at not only decline in populations, but the status of species. And I referred to the red list before. When I worked on this red list in 1996, we knew that 25% of mammals were threatened with extinction. We then wanted to understand how much of every major group is threatened. So we took the groups we had taxonomic lists for, and we took a random sample for groups that are invertebrates, so species without a backbone, and plants. And we found that across the board, although there was variation, you have about 20% of the world's species threatened with extinction, 20 to 25%. And it's amazing. So if you're walking through the forest or swimming in the ocean, about 1 in 4, or sort of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 species are actually threatened. And this obviously leads to extinctions. And you say, well, there's always been extinction, but are extinction rates higher now than they've been in the past? And the answer is they're hundreds, if not thousands times higher than they were in the historic records. And I kind of thought I knew all the stats about the status of the world's species, but this paper came out a few years ago and really shocked me. And what it's showing us is mammals divided by biomass. So look at the room you're in and picture that as like all the biomass. So looking at this figure here, you would have 60% of your room filled with livestock. And then 36% of the room is filled with humans, and 4% is just wild animals. So what that means is that everything from elephants to mice to whales has to be in that 4%. So we've basically converted biomass into ourselves or things we eat. Because if you went back 200 years, the wild figure would be way over 50%. So the IPBES, which is a sort of a report on the status of the world's biodiversity, estimated that we stand to lose over 1 million species with business as usual. But I would say this is a gross underestimate. I mean, if you assume there could be 1 trillion species and 20-25% are potentially threatened, and we're entering an era of mass habitat change and global warming, we're going to see many millions of species that are potentially going to go extinct. So the question is, what can we do? And obviously we can reduce, we can reuse, we can recycle, we can invest responsibly, buy responsibly, all those things, vote responsibly. But I would argue that we really have to redefine our relationship with nature if we're going to address this effectively. And that's why we started On the Edge. We really wanted to help people understand the full value of biodiversity, so we start making the right decisions. Now, there's different ways to explain the value of biodiversity. I'm not going to go into them all, but if we look at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and which highlights the Sustainable Development Goals, we see that an argument is often made that we should save biodiversity because it's useful to us. But with that argument, it's important because we're sort of utilitarian creatures and rational, but we don't even know all the species on the planet, which has already been discussed. And we certainly don't know what's useful to us. So it's not the best philosophy for us to really make the only argument for biodiversity. And I would argue we have to think more about the other forms of life on the planet as a moral responsibility, that we can't be at war with the rest of life, that we have to think about the intrinsic value of all species with which we share the planet. We also have to think about how much of the space of the planet is shared with other forms of life. And we did a paper not too long ago arguing that we need at least 50% of the planet to maintain a healthy, thriving, diverse species and ecosystems. So this map here shows you the areas of the planet that are still relatively intact. In gray, it's the areas that have been converted. This shows you the amount of protected areas. We're currently at about 17%, many are paper parks. And then we're about 6% in the ocean. But again, we need to be at about 50% protected, and that's what we have left. And we need about the same in the oceans. And this is actually what people want. We did a survey at the Zoological Society of London. We did a survey at Nat Geo, and it turns out that people actually want to protect and secure about half the planet. So it's not only the scientific answer, it's also what society is asking for. So what can the gaming sector do? And everyone here probably listening has much better ideas than I do, and a number have already been recommended. But basically, we can make sure we're not vilifying nature to start, and we can make sure we're not promoting games that exploit the natural world. We should have games that highlight the amazing diversity of life, such as the Save the Purple Frog game that On the Edge has just launched, which helps people understand a threatened species in its own particular context. But you can develop games that help people solve the great challenges of the 21st century, games that get kids outdoors, games that are raising funds for conservation as a whole. And obviously, we've just heard about all the things you can do to be more responsible in terms of climate, but we also have to think about responsibility in terms of having a negative impact on the world's species and ecosystems. So that's a really quick tour of the status of the world's biodiversity. Not all such a rosy story, but I just want to end by saying climate change is extremely important. We need to focus on it, address it across the board. But equally, we have to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're making sure that we're maintaining the Earth's life support system, and that's life itself. Thank you.